used to think I had it all figured out. My name is Sarah, and for 8 years, I believed I was living the dream. Marcus and I had built what everyone called the perfect life. A beautiful house in the suburbs, successful careers, and what seemed like an unshakable marriage. I was a financial advisor who had worked her way up from nothing, and Marcus was a real estate developer who always talked about our empire and our legacy. But perfection, I've learned, is often just a carefully constructed illusion. The first crack in our facade appeared on a Tuesday morning in March. I was making coffee when Marcus's phone buzzed on the counter. The message preview was enough to make my blood run cold. Can't wait to see you tonight, baby. Hotel room 314, like always. V. My hands trembled as I set down the coffee mug. 8 years of marriage, and I thought I knew every corner of this man's life. Apparently, I knew nothing at all. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I did what any good financial advisor would do. I gathered information. Over the next few weeks, I became a detective in my own life. I discovered that V was Victoria, a 26-year-old marketing coordinator at one of Marcus's development projects. Their affair had been going on for over a year, and judging by the credit card statements I found hidden in his office, he'd been spending our money on expensive dinners, jewelry, and weekend getaways. But the real shock came when I found the documents he'd been hiding in his home office safe. I knew the combination. It was our anniversary date, which now felt like a cruel joke. Inside, I discovered that Marcus had been secretly transferring assets, setting up offshore accounts, and preparing to file for divorce. He wanted to leave me with nothing while he rode off into the sunset with his young girlfriend. The papers were methodical, calculated. He'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. Every romantic dinner, every I love you, every discussion about our future. It had all been a lie while he systematically dismantled our life together. That night, as I lay in bed next to him, listening to him sleep peacefully, I realized something important. Marcus had made a critical error. He assumed I was just the devoted wife who handled the household finances while he made the real business decisions. He had no idea that I'd been quietly building my own financial expertise and network for years. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called in sick to work. Instead of going to my office, I drove to a small cafe across town and started making phone calls. If Marcus wanted to play games with our finances, he'd picked the wrong opponent. My first call was to Janet, my closest friend and a divorce attorney. I need your help, I said, but this has to stay completely confidential. Janet had seen enough messy divorces to know exactly what I was dealing with. She recommended a private investigator and gave me the name of a forensic accountant who specialized in hidden assets. The private investigator, Tony, was a former police detective who looked like he'd stepped out of a noir film. Mrs. Richardson, he said, studying the evidence I'd gathered. Your husband's been sloppy. Men having affairs usually are. They think they're being clever, but they leave trails everywhere. Within 2 weeks, Tony had compiled a comprehensive report. Marcus wasn't just cheating. He was stealing from his own business partners, skimming money from development projects, and had been living a double life for over 2 years. The offshore accounts I'd discovered were just the tip of the iceberg. But the most damaging information came from Victoria herself. Tony had befriended her at a local gym, and she was surprisingly chatty about her relationship with Marcus. She bragged about how he was going to divorce his boring wife, and how they were planning to move to Costa Rica together. She even showed Tony photos of the house Marcus had secretly purchased there under a shell company. Meanwhile, I was conducting my own investigation into our joint finances. As a financial advisor, I had access to resources and databases that most people don't. I discovered that Marcus had been forging my signature on loan applications, had taken out a second mortgage on our house without my knowledge, and had been using my credit to secure business loans for his failing development projects. The forensic accountant, David, was amazed by what we uncovered. In 30 years of doing this, I've rarely seen someone so systematically steal from their own spouse, he said. But he's made mistakes. Big ones. And because you're a joint owner of most of these assets, you have rights he clearly doesn't understand. That's when I realized Marcus's biggest mistake. He'd underestimated me. He saw me as the supportive wife who nodded along with his business decisions, not as the financial professional who understood exactly how money moved and how to trace it. I spent my evenings pretending everything was normal, cooking dinner and asking about his day, while secretly documenting every asset, every account, and every illegal transaction he'd made. Marcus would come home, kiss me on the cheek, and tell me about his stressful day at work, while I smiled and nodded, knowing he'd actually spent his afternoon with Victoria. 3 months into my investigation, I had assembled what Janet called the most comprehensive financial fraud case she'd ever seen. But I wasn't ready to make my move yet. I needed to ensure that when I struck, it would be devastating and final. I began by securing my own financial independence. Using my professional network, I quietly started transferring money from our joint accounts into a separate account Marcus didn't know about. I was careful to only move money that was legally mine, my salary, my bonuses, and my share of legitimate investments. Then I did something that would later prove crucial. I started recording our conversations. Every time Marcus lied about where he'd been, every time he denied spending money on Victoria, every time he talked about our future while planning to abandon me, I captured it all. The recordings revealed just how calculating Marcus had become. In one conversation, he actually coached me on how to save money by cutting back on my personal expenses while he was secretly spending thousands on his mistress. In another, he suggested we should simplify our finances by consolidating everything into accounts he controlled. But my most valuable discovery came from an unexpected source. While cleaning out old files, I found documents showing that Marcus had been stealing from his business partners for years. He'd been skimming money from development projects, falsifying construction costs, and pocketing the difference. This wasn't just adultery and divorce fraud. This was criminal behavior that could send him to prison. I made copies of everything and stored them in a safety deposit box at a bank across town. Then I began reaching out to his business partners, carefully planting seeds of doubt about Marcus's financial management. I didn't accuse him directly. I simply asked innocent questions about project budgets and timelines that made them start looking more closely at their books. Meanwhile, Marcus was becoming increasingly impatient with Victoria. Through Tony's surveillance, we learned that she was pressuring him to leave me immediately. She wanted to go public with their relationship and was tired of being the other woman. This urgency was making Marcus sloppy, and he accelerated his timeline for the divorce. One evening in June, Marcus came home with flowers and champagne. "Sarah," he said, "I think we need to talk about our marriage." He was finally ready to make his move, to present me with divorce papers and his carefully orchestrated plan to leave me with nothing. But I was ready too. I had documentation of every crime, every lie, and every stolen dollar. I had evidence that would not only destroy him in divorce court, but could also send him to prison. And I had something else. A plan that would leave him with absolutely nothing while I rebuilt my life with the resources he'd tried to steal from me. Marcus chose a Saturday morning to deliver what he thought would be his killing blow. He'd made breakfast, something he rarely did, and was being unusually attentive. I knew this was it. "Sarah, I think we need to talk about our future," he began, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "I've been thinking that maybe we've grown apart. Maybe it's time we considered a separation." I played my part perfectly. I looked shocked, hurt, confused. "Marcus, what are you talking about? I thought we were happy." He handed me the divorce papers his lawyer had prepared. As I read through them, I had to fight to keep my expression neutral. According to his proposal, I would receive a minimal settlement, no alimony, and he would keep the house, the business, and all major assets. He claimed our debts were primarily my responsibility. "I know this is hard," he said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "But I think this is best for both of us. I'll make sure you're taken care of." That phrase, "I'll make sure you're taken care of," was the final insult. This man who had been systematically stealing from me for years was now offering me crumbs from my own table. "I need time to think," I said, my voice shaking with what he thought was distress but was actually rage. "Of course," he replied. "Take all the time you need. But Sarah, I hope you understand that fighting this would be expensive and difficult. It's better if we can work this out amicably." The threat was clear. He believed he held all the cards, and resistance would be futile. That afternoon, while Marcus was playing golf, actually with Victoria, I made my move. I called Janet and told her it was time. Within hours, Marcus was served with my divorce papers, documents that would change everything. My petition didn't just ask for a fair division of assets. It detailed every crime Marcus had committed, every dollar he'd stolen, and every lie he'd told. I was seeking full ownership of all assets, criminal prosecution for fraud, and damages for emotional distress. But that was just the beginning. I had also filed complaints with the State Attorney General's office, the IRS, and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The evidence I'd gathered over 6 months painted a picture of a man who had committed multiple felonies and was planning to flee the country with stolen money. When Marcus came home that evening, he found federal agents waiting in our driveway. His offshore accounts had been frozen, his passport had been confiscated, and he was under investigation for tax evasion, fraud, and money laundering. The look on his face when he saw me standing there, no longer the naive wife he thought he could manipulate, was something I'll never forget. For the first time in our marriage, Marcus was completely speechless. The next few months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, but I was prepared for every battle. Marcus's lawyer tried to argue that I was being vindictive, that I was exaggerating the financial irregularities. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The forensic accountant testified that Marcus had stolen over $2.3 million from our joint assets and his business partners. The private investigator presented surveillance footage and recorded conversations that proved the extent of his deception. And I testified about years of financial abuse and manipulation. But the most damaging testimony came from Marcus's own business partners. Once they realized how he'd been stealing from them, they cooperated fully with the investigation. Victoria, desperate to save herself, turned state's evidence and provided details about Marcus's plans to flee the country. Marcus's carefully constructed house of cards collapsed completely. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud and tax evasion. His business assets were seized to pay restitution to his victims. And in our divorce settlement, I received everything: the house, the legitimate business assets, and even the Costa Rica property he'd tried to hide. But the most satisfying moment came when I realized that Marcus's own greed had been his downfall. If he had simply asked for a fair divorce, he might have walked away with millions. Instead, his attempt to leave me with nothing had cost him everything. Victoria, meanwhile, had her own problems. She was charged as an accessory to fraud and faced deportation since she was in the country on a work visa. The woman who had bragged about stealing my husband ended up with nothing but legal bills and a criminal record. Today, I own a successful financial consulting firm that helps other women protect their assets during divorce. I've turned my painful experience into a mission to educate women about their financial rights and how to recognize the warning signs of financial abuse. Marcus is currently serving his sentence in a minimum security prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 6 years, but he'll emerge to find that the empire he thought he was building has crumbled completely. Meanwhile, I've built a new life based on honesty, integrity, and the knowledge that I never again have to depend on someone else for my security. The man who tried to leave me penniless after cheating learned the hardest lesson of all: never underestimate the woman you betrayed. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad, it's getting everything.